So my name is Eric Prud'hommeaux, and it says here that I work on Schemas. This is a pretty quick talk. I'm just going to whine a little bit about the effort in putting in and querying structured data, the effort in contributing structured data, as if I'd know something about it, because I'm actually not that great a contributor, but I do validation instead. And then contrast documentation by example from documentation by definition, and then show you a couple of Schemas features. So if I want to query countries, it's sort of complex and idiomatic, and you can tell by just sort of counting the number of people who've whined about it on Stack Overflow. And so the problems with it are, some of them are geopolitical realities, and it's actually, every time you want to ask a question like that, it's more complex than you think it's going to be. And some of them are just because people made arbitrary modeling choices because they didn't have a ton of guidance when they were entering data. So contributors have sort of a Sisyphean task. They have this enormous task of how to model something in Wikidata. And so I'm talking about anybody who's, something like geographic or genotypic, or, basically the whole spectrum of things that we all understand to things that only a few people understand. All of those people have to figure out how they're going to model their data when they contribute it. And so the ways they can go about this, they can guess from the available properties, which means they have to look at about 10,000 properties, a little over 1,100. No, 10,000, 1,000. Maybe it was 1,000. I think I might be off by a factor of 10 there. But still, 1,000 properties, or 1,100 or so. So that's a lot. They could guess from a survey of existing data, but that means they end up reproducing whatever they happen to hit, which means you end up producing islands of conformance, and there'll be another island of conformance, and there's no, you have needless divergence between them. And then of course, every time you want to create a new property because you need to model something very specific, then you have a long road ahead of you. So a lot of the documentation happens by example. Well, a lot of it is implicit. Just say, well, I want to go and enter some data. Well, what's something that looks like it? I will replicate that. That's pretty much by example without even having said, well, here's a canonical example. What's happening is that the person who is entering the data is basically looking at each column in isolation, or each attribute in isolation. They're saying, well, what this property? How do I put this property in? How do I put this property in? And there's no guidance for domain-specific links between resource types. So if I'm putting in something complex that involves multiple resource types, and there's some actual real depth to the data structures, then I don't really know what links to use between those things. And a rigorous survey to find out, for me to go and look and see, well, how should I contribute this data, could take hours or days, and I will develop a lot more expertise in the process than I ever wanted to have. And so really in summation, there's no central place to establish or review community practice for data modeling. Well, there are for individual properties, right? So you can look at the properties and say, well, there are constraints on these, and you could possibly look at Recoin or something like that and say, okay, now I want to find out what are the properties I should be putting in there. But basically, that's coordination we should discuss maybe at the end of this talk. So of course, my advocacy is for documentation by definition. And so CHIP expressions provide guidance for constellations of entity structures, meaning I've got a whole bunch of different structures I got to be putting in because I'm modeling something complex. Maybe, like GeneWiki does with Andra, or like CAT does with file formats and stuff like that. And so the Schemas gives me guidance and says, here are the properties that are expected. Here are their data types. Here are their cardinalities. It gives me, it's all written down in first-class entities with Wikidata entities with edit logs and discussions, which means if I want to argue about the way CAT has modeled something like a file type or an emulator, I can go to that page and can, connect to the talk page and say, well, I think this should look more like this, and then we can have an actual argument there in like a concrete argument. So communities with different use cases can have their own schemas. You can still diverge. You don't all have to conform to the same schema.